We just want to start this podcast off by saying the content today could be sensitive to some of you out there listening, so just beware and keep that in mind. Hello and welcome to On Deadline. I'm Kendra Nichols.
I'm Amanda St. Hilaire.
And I'm James Crummel, in for Dennis. Thanks for joining us.
If you're listening for the first time, we are journalists for ABC 27 News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
But on this podcast, we talk about issues that affect people all over.
These are the conversations you don't hear on the news. We're different generations with different experiences, so we don't always agree.
But we do get very personal, we get very real, and hopefully we get you thinking.
We're recording on October 30th, 2017, and today we are tackling the issue of sexual abuse and harassment. This topic has been in the headlines for days, I guess almost weeks now, following the news of dozens of sexual abuse accusations against powerful Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein, and they keep coming in. Shortly after the news broke, the hashtag metoo spread like wildfire on social media. Women who have experienced sexual abuse or harassment using that hashtag to spread awareness and show how widespread this issue really is. So what are we going to talk about today? What exactly is considered sexual abuse or harassment? Is there a double standard? And I'm talking about from a men's perspective and a woman's perspective. We'll explain. How can we talk to our kids and each other about this issue? And what can we do as a society to prevent sexual abuse and harassment? So here to help us answer those questions, Kristen Houser, Chief Public Affairs Officer, National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
I know that you've been contacted by a lot of media outlets over the past couple of weeks, but we really wanted to tackle this issue. And how would you, reflecting over the past couple of weeks, is this a good, bad thing, in between?
It is almost wholly a good thing. Number one, these are issues that we as a society normally don't talk about. And when there is silence around it, that compounds shame and stigma that victims often feel. It increases feelings of isolation, and none of those things are good for a person's mental health or recovery following a sexual assault or after experiencing ongoing abuse or harassment. So the fact that we have a nation talking about this is a really good thing. I think that's exactly why we saw the metoo hashtag spread like wildfire. This is the latest in a series of things I think we've seen similar happen over the past 3-4 years in how social media is really breaking down some of the barriers, the stigma, and the isolation. So I think it's a great thing. What I like even more is that with this, we're not just talking about, look how frequent it is. People are asking these questions about what can we do to be part of the solution. We're having good conversation about what's the role for men to play. And it is high time that we have those conversations, because this is not a women's issue. While women may be overly represented, extremely overly represented in terms of victimization, this impacts families, relationships, the workplace, your educational environment. This is a societal issue. So we're all impacted by the fallout from abuse, and we all can be part of the solution.
And that's key to note, because whenever there's something that is social media related, I worry that it will fizzle out or it will become a trend and not something we really get beneath the surface of, because people have very short memories.
Right.
I will say, though, after the hashtag started, I had several male friends come up and ask me, could you say that too? And I was like, the first person asked me that, I was like, what? And then I was like, you know what, actually, yeah, I can. Were you surprised from a male perspective, James? Were you surprised by the hashtag? I know we're not surprised by the news of what was happening in Hollywood. I don't think anybody was truly shocked. I think the shock was that people were talking about it.
Yeah, and I think as women, we tend to be like, oh yeah, that's happened to me.
Yeah.
And James, what did you think?
So I want to say yes and no. I mean, I've heard stories before, and it's not shocking that this has been happening to women. I think the thing that was shocking was the amount of women that I know that it has happened to. And I think that on Facebook and Twitter and all of social media just really brought that to light. So I think that was what I was most surprised by.
And I think that's so important, because it's real easy for us all to think that this happens to other people, right? Other people do it and other people are impacted by it. So if you think it's not in your social circle or your family or your own workplace, then it's real easy to feel like, well, then I don't have to worry about it. But this has really opened up I think, eyes for a lot of people that, actually my immediate family, my closest friends, my colleagues, they're all impacted by it. And I think that is what's motivating the conversation about then what can I do to be part of the solution?
And I think we need to start by talking about what is sexual harassment, sexual abuse. How do you define it? I think the first thing that comes to mind is a cat call, somebody whistling at you. Is that sexual harassment? And does that depend on the person?
Well, it can certainly depend on the person as to whether or not, to what degree they might feel bothered or threatened by it. But in a nutshell, yes. I mean, the easy definition is these things fall along a spectrum in terms of degree of maybe personal violation or degree of contact, and they may go from things that aren't criminal all the way up to things that you could be facing life in prison for. But the bottom definition is that we're talking about any form of unwanted sexual contact. So somebody that you don't know is yelling sexual comments at you on the street, then yeah, that is sexual harassment. And what we also need to keep in mind is it would be real easy to sit on the outside and be like, well, hey, that's just one comment, nothing really happened, so what's the big deal? Don't overreact. Well, nice for you to say, but you don't know if the person who was just yelled at on the street is somebody who's had other experiences of sexual violence in their life. And if that is the case, then having a stranger scream something sexual at you on the street may make you feel incredibly unsafe. It might be completely disruptive to your day and how you're able to feel comfortable in the world. So, we can't just give passes based on what our personal experiences are. I think what this movement is showing is that these things are frequently, commonly experienced as violations, and that there's an outcome, there's an impact of those violations.
Because I think what hinders the conversation is the mentality that sexual assault is the stranger lurking in the dark alleyway only, or that sexual harassment is only this. And we take the extreme cases,
right,
and we hear the extreme cases, which are terrible. But growing up, I think women, we learn to work around the quote smaller things,
right,
and then it just ends up feeling way more normal. We there's a lot, when you think about it, that we adjust about how we go about our day, about how we work, how we speak, how we look, because you grow up with all of that.
That's right.
But I also think young girls are sometimes, I don't know if conditioned is the right word, to think that that's good when guys react to you
double
like
messages.
Yes.
There's double messages about the value of your sexuality.
Right.
Yeah.
And that can be confusing, because if you watch videos or you watch TV,
it's like, oh, well, it's a compliment.
Right. That's a good thing when guys are catcalling you. That means you're pretty. That means this. So it can be confusing, I think, sometimes. And maybe for the guys, too. Maybe they look at that and think, oh, that's how I show my appreciation for a woman. And from what they're seeing on TV, I don't know. But I think that I want to address that issue. When I first said this to you, I said double standard, and you made this face like, what? But I do believe there are people out there that believe there's a double standard when it comes to men and women in this issue. And we gave the example of, there was a recent picture of Ellen with Katy Perry and her wife, and she was making like a googly eyes at Katy Perry's breast area. And they were saying, if that was a man doing that in the picture, this would have been huge news. This would have been sexual harassment. So what do you think about that example? Is it fair?
I think that's a terrible example. And here's why. Ellen's a comedian. They have a pre-existing relationship, and they're screwing around. And if it had been a male comedian doing the same kind of thing, I really don't know if it would have made the same kind of headlines. I also think this moment in time changes it, because we are focusing in on this. And I don't think that that's a good example. But there are double standards. But I don't think that they are double standards in the way that people are perhaps presenting it. I think sometimes we present double standards like, well, men are really getting an unfair examination under the microscope, and what about women? There's a little bit of room for that conversation, because there certainly are women who behave very badly and do none of the rest of us favors, and they do make other men feel threatened or ashamed or humiliated or embarrassed in those moments, and that does need to be taken seriously. But where we see the double standard come coming in, is that it's more about society not taking male victimization seriously. And as you mentioned also, where we see this a lot are cases where you might have an adolescent male student in a high school whose female instructor has been sexually abusing him, and the community acts like, and you will read it in the comments on the online news articles about
way to go, young man.
Yeah, way to go,
he gets
or
high
getting an
five.
education, that type of thing. And the reality is, our centers, our rape crisis programs, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the country, see men who are coming in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, dealing with the stuffed down emotional fallout of being sexually abused, feeling like they couldn't tell any about it because they're well aware of the double standard. And then if they did have something come out, like that kind of disregard for how painful that was, for
confusing
the power imbalance, all of those things. I mean, it leaves male survivors with emotional trauma, just like sexual assault leaves female survivors
and flip
with
it, and
emotional
it's a
trauma.
girl, and then she's called all kinds of names.
Right.
Well, what bothers me, though, is I feel like and anything can be used as a tool in an argument, right? And that's why you need to be careful about the social media debates. But with the posts following the metoo hashtag, I saw some people bring up male assault victims, and it is a conversation we need to have. But it bothers me when people only bring that up in a context in which women are sharing their stories. Because it's almost like saying, well, right, but yours doesn't matter as much. And I think the way we bring that up, especially when someone is sharing their personal experience, we need to be really careful about that.
James, what were you going to say there? I want the male to be able to weigh in here.
Well, the question I was going just to pose to you when you were talking about, the differences, the way that males and females are treated in that situation, like when you're talking about maybe with a teacher. But it also seems like the justice system treats them differently too, because it seems like a man who was convicted of that kind of crime will go to jail for a long time, and a woman might not.
Well, I would say two things. I think, number one, we would like to think that men in that situation go to jail for a long time, but if we really look at the sentencing, we might not see that. I think sometimes when you have adolescent victims, if they're not egregious crimes with other kinds of violence and like real overt stalking, but when the offender drapes their manipulation and grooming under the guise of romance, I think that we see those crimes actually not getting taken very seriously in the justice system, no matter what the gender of the victim is. So I think that that's just really a demonstration that not just the system, but the system is a reflection of our society, right, in our juries. So I think that really demonstrates that our culture is still very confused about the difference between what is a consensual sexual relationship and what isn't. And in those cases, I mean, our state, every state has said there are some situations in which the power imbalance is inherent and makes consent impossible, no matter what the age of the people are. So in Pennsylvania, you may be 16 or 17 years old, which means that you are above the age of legal consent in most cases in the state of Pennsylvania. But we also say if it is a teacher, if it is like a doctor, if it is if you are a detainee in a juvenile detention center and the person who's the adult is somebody that's employed there are inherent situations where you can't consent because there's a power imbalance in the relationship, and that means romance doesn't exist in that time either, because you can't consent. So that is an abuse and manipulation of power. We don't do a good job talking about offender dynamics. Part of that is because a lot of times we don't know who the offenders are. Victims are afraid to report. Our culture has moved to this real knee-jerky kind of place of, well, we're not going to discuss the offender unless he's been convicted in a court of law, which, by the way, happens almost never because most cases don't make it there. But we don't bother then to look at research or talk to people that do offender treatment and really understand what drives some of these things, the different ways people are manipulating, why are they making these decisions, what's it give for them. When you understand offender behavior, then when you look at a teacher who thinks that they're they're going to try to seduce a 15 or 16-year-old student. You see that for what that is, which is a direct abuse of power. Maybe that meets some emotional need for them. Maybe they're just, looking for inappropriate kinds of things, we used to say that it's always about power and control, but that's actually not true. For many people who commit these crimes, the way that we have sexualized power and control and exploitation really does get in the mix. So sex sometimes is a part of it. It's a complex thing, and you can't paint all offenders by the same brush. Even in some of these other cases, though, that have come out from Hollywood, I talked to a reporter from Variety magazine last week who's breaking a story, I believe tomorrow, about another Hollywood director who, there's an actress, I guess, who's coming forward. And the story that he relayed to me about the emotional and verbal assault, like the emotional manipulation of this actress and what he asked her to do in her so-called audition, and then what he did to her. It's not like an outright rape. It doesn't count that. But the malicious intent behind it, when you read the story, when it breaks tomorrow, I mean, it was chilling. Asking her to think about the most painful thing that she had ever endured, put herself in that place, and then tell him the story while she undressed. And this woman was a survivor of child sexual abuse. I mean, when somebody goes to that length, I mean, that is really demonstrating
manipulation,
demeaning. But that they have some kind of sexual arousal out of demeaning another person. So, when you hear those,
you're getting really
things,
deep now.
Yeah, it's a very disturbing thing, and that's my point. We can't just say, "Oh gosh, it was just verbal. It doesn't matter." That is often not true. The verbal stuff is really painful for people. It can create a very threatening environment. It can open very painful past wounds and make you feel unsafe in the present. So you don't get to sit around and judge and label other people's experiences. We have to listen to them and take them at face value about what it meant to them, because these are personal experiences.
Well, and can we take a minute on that note and talk about intent? Because as a woman, I am sick of navigating other people's intentions. I'm really tired of hearing, well, he probably didn't mean it that way, and he's older, so he grew up in a different time. If I run someone over with my car unintentionally and they die, I'm still getting charged with involuntary manslaughter. It's not as bad as if I tried to mow the person down, but I am still held responsible for my actions because they had a huge effect on someone's life. So if someone unintentionally, quote, unintentionally, is harassing me, I feel like there should still be accountability, and that's a lot harder to come by.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things to that I think are really important. What I keep saying is I think most females in our culture who are over the age of 12 have some understanding of what the difference is between a compliment and somebody who's saying something creepy and invasive to you. I mean, we all know what that feeling is like, and you learn it early. So I don't really appreciate other people also second guessing, like, oh, well, gosh, are you sure you're reading that right? Yes, I've had 35 years experience of reading that properly.
It's a physical reaction. You actually get a physical reaction.
Right.
Like, ugh.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that. And again, that's another example of not taking women at face value, that we actually know what we're experiencing in the world. But on top of that, I think we need to look at the culture that gives these mixed messages. So this came up a lot last week in the stories that the three actresses had about being groped by former President George W. Bush, and his staff saying, this is how he lightens the mood. He tells the same joke, and he's been known to grab women on the bottoms.
What did they say? A good-natured pat on the rump,
right,
I think is how they phrased it.
Right. So, I'm not going to put my place in his head and say what it was or wasn't, but I'm going to look at the bigger culture that says, what are we putting out there? If this man really does think that that's an appropriate way to make a joke, he's got a very different message than the women on the receiving end who feel like they've been carrying a secret for years and now need to let it out. They clearly felt violated, even if that wasn't his intention. But beyond that, what's going on in our culture that the rest of us are willing to sit back and say, the intention of the offender is the thing we're willing to listen to.
Right. We're not going to strive for better.
Right,
we're going to say boys will be boys.
Right.
So I guess earlier you asked if I was surprised by all of this, and I would. To me, I think I'm more surprised by the reaction that's come out since then. We're talking about different generations and how different people respond to things. And to me, I would think, in my bubble, that it's 2017 and that we have come a long, long way in
Everything's
the past
fixed
years.
now.
But one of the reactions that really surprised me was this these different corporations and companies where the men are saying, well, you know what, we can't say anything to women, so I don't want to be in a room with a woman at all alone. We can't do that anymore. And to me, that's just very surprising to me that at 2017, a man can say, I can't be trusted to be in a room alone with a woman. I don't know what to say, so we just won't do it.
Exactly.
Well, and going off that, you have the people saying this is turning into a witch hunt. We're not allowing men to be men anymore. Everyone's overly sensitive. You can't make a joke. I think we've all heard variations of that at some point.
Excusing offender behavior.
Right.
I mean, there are lots of places in the world where these things are not nearly as prevalent as they are in the United States. But I also think, we have different pockets of people in our life, right? Like, I know which group of my friends I'm not going to hear inappropriate jokes from. There are people who know how to behave appropriately, still be friendly, still have a good time, still tell jokes. They're just not ones that make me feel threatened. So it's your point is so well taken. It's an insult to all men for anybody to say that it's our base nature that if we're alone with a woman, we're probably going to be inappropriate. So for everybody's benefit, we'll just keep the sexes separate. Plus, I mean, what does that really do then for women in the workplace? I mean, to me that sounds like it's a pushback to the Handmaid's Tale, going in that direction.
It's almost not giving men enough credit for the self-control that you have.
Right.
And if someone's sitting there telling me, well, I should be able to say whatever I want, and if you're uncomfortable, it means you're easily offended. It's like, well, now you're telling me that you can say whatever you want, but I don't get to call you on it. So I have to censor myself so that you don't have to.
So that brings me around to one of the things that people keep asking me, like, what's the takeaway from this? What can we learn from this? I think one of the biggest takeaways that this case, and again, like, this is one in a series. So Bill Cosby, right? We have 60 women who have publicly talked about being sexually assaulted by him. Harvey Weinstein, now we're up there. The other director, James Toback.
Yeah. I'm not as familiar with him.
Yeah. I mean, how many, if we look at what we know about sexual offenders, it's that they do this repeatedly. It's not a miscommunication between two individual people that was the wrong turn of events.
Sure, and that can
these
happen.
Are serial
you
behaviors.
can have miscommunications, sure. But as you're saying, it's over and over and over again.
And this isn't just about a single miscommunication. This is about a pattern that's been well honed, that they have a good MO that works on how you isolate people, how you lure them, what the carrot is. Like, I'm going to help you with your career. I'm going to get you a part. I'm going to set you up in the business. People who commit these crimes have those tools that they use. And it may be different for different people, but in these high profile cases, that's what we have. So I sit back and I say, the problem is if a single person comes forward with an allegation, we all sit back and say, gosh, I don't know if I'm willing to believe that one person and take them at their word.
Yeah, and how were they dressed and why were they there late and blah, 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 blah.
Right. But then when everyone comes forward, well, why didn't you say something sooner?
Right. So my point is, when we look at this metoo hashtag, which isn't just like, I've been catcalled. People have been sharing very personal stories of significant experiences.
Life-changing moments.
Exactly. Life-changing experiences of sexual violence. And it is so widespread. At what point do we as a culture say, I don't need evidence of 12 other people with the exact same story. I recognize that this is a serious and pervasive issue in our culture. And every time somebody comes forward, the right response is to start by believing. You can let the chips fall later, but there's no reason to not start by believing, because what do we know? We know, number one, that most victims do not lie about these cases. There are multiple research studies that show that rates of false reporting are extremely low. And we also know that most offenders, when they're caught, say they didn't do it.
Right.
So why do we keep giving the benefit of the doubt to people that are accused when in reality that flies in the face of what's real in the world?
Women are more likely to lie about being raped than a man is to lie about raping.
Right.
And it is interesting because you don't really see this with any other crime.
Thank you.
If someone said they were robbed, you automatically believe them. Oh my gosh, we got to catch the jerk who did this.
Yeah,
You don't say, well,
exactly.
were you really robbed? When someone else comes forward in your neighborhood and says they were robbed,
What
then
kind of
maybe
insurance
I'll
do
look.
you have?
That's a good point. That's a good
Haven't
point.
you given this person money in the past?
Yeah.
Right.
But, guys didn't have to, when everything came out with Ryan Lochte lying about his whole situation
The
in
Olympic
Rio,
swimmer,
saying he was
yes.
held up, and it came out that did not happen. The guys around the world didn't have to go, wow, this is so disheartening. I'm going to have such a hard time if I ever get held up being believed if I report this.
Right.
Whereas, and there are cases where there are false reports of any crime, including sexual assault. And whenever something like that comes out, I think every woman who's had an experience with that goes, ugh, that's made it so much harder for the rest of us because it does undergo a level of scrutiny that other crimes do not.
All right, don't get mad at me because I didn't say this, but we were watching the coverage when they announced that second Hollywood director, who I'm sorry, was also very unattractive as well as Harvey. There was a man in the room who said, if these were good-looking men, these women wouldn't be saying these things.
Oh my God.
And I often wonder I'm sure you've heard these things before. How do you respond when somebody says something like that?
I usually use inappropriate language.
And I'm sure they were joking.
What's the diplomatic response?
It may have been a joke, but I often wonder, sometimes I think we try to make just a joke out of these things.
But it's also, that though is going back to like our cultural fallback of, I really believe it is an intentional conflating of consensual sex and sexual assault. So if we're going to make this about, well, if he was good looking, they'd probably want to do it and then it wouldn't be a crime. Like that is not it. We're talking about an abuse, a systemic, repetitive abuse of power that this man has damaged the lives of dozens of women who are now finally feeling the ability to come forward. Like it's not a moment to joke about.
I just want to get you fired up.
Yeah,
I'm
thank you.
All right, so let's go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, along the lines that you just said, and again, to arguments that I just thought that were well past. I heard a lot since all this has come out about saying about, did they bring this on themselves, about the way that they dressed, about the way they acted. And many of these were women who said this. Just Donna Karen recently said something like that, Maya Bialik.
So upsetting.
So these were women who were saying these things, and I really thought that argument was long gone.
I keep hoping, I'm waiting for the day for that to be long gone, but I think two things. When you start recognizing how pervasive this is, it can make you feel unsafe. Like even if you're not sitting at home feeling worried, like on a visceral level, you really recognize this happens to everybody. I think it's a place many people go that we think, well, I wouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. And that is a fruitless argument because this is the thing. Vulnerability is in the eye of the perpetrator. So I might think if I don't drink and if I don't wear clothing of a certain color or a certain cut, that's going to lower my risk of somebody assaulting me. Well, maybe the person likes my age group or likes somebody of my height and stature, or maybe they like that I have a communication disorder, which means that I have a harder time talking about what happened to me, or maybe they like that I just came out of anesthesia. Or, I mean, look, when you look at what really happens in the world, we could all keep ourselves, we being women, we could keep ourselves locked in our homes and communicate with nobody, so we take no risk at all of sending a mixed message to anyone, and that still doesn't protect us from the guy who gets off about breaking into a home and terrorizing somebody. So, I'm not saying women stop doing the things that you do to make you feel safe. I mean, do what you have to do, but for anybody else to sit there and say, well, you didn't take care of those risk factors, it's an unfair burden to put on somebody who's just been victimized. And it also, it just is redirecting. Instead of us saying, what did he do to set her up? We are looking at the wrong things, because what we know about sexual assault, this is not a miscommunication. We know men absolutely are capable of behaving properly. And on top of that, that's why these are crimes that most often are happening in private, because you have the offender who's making strategic decisions about where, when, how, and who. If this was really an impulse that people couldn't control, we could go to pick up lunch at McDonald's and you're going to see it happen in the parking lot, see it happen in the grocery store, see it happen in the work. That's not what happens. These are strategic decisions about where, when, who, and how. And that means if somebody can decide that they're going to act in those situations, you also have the choice of not acting in those situations, which, by the way, is how most men do behave. But focusing on victims' behavior, again, it's skewing our view away from what's important. If we're going to start addressing these crimes, we have to start being willing to recognize red flag behavior and intervening. And that's not just waiting till you see somebody escorting somebody out of a building and you're going on a rescue mission. This is about changing those cultural things that we have normalized, interrupting those gray areas, those so-called gray areas, and redirecting so that we are consistently backing up that the norms we expect to see are respectful communication, kindness, looking out for one another, that when you stick up for somebody, exactly, those basic things that people walk away from.
And I don't think it's that big of a leap for how much time women spend navigating whether we're sending mixed signals, to ask men to maybe spend even half as much time navigating the signals you're sending to women and making them feel uncomfortable. And I think the reason there's such a reaction to that is that's a standard that has not been as heavily enforced. But that brings us to the whole argument of, well, they grew up at a different time when you're talking about a, quote, older man. And that's the what Harvey Weinstein used in one of his initial statements. What do you think about that argument? It's a different time.
I think it's always been inappropriate to masturbate into a potted plant in a restaurant. I don't think that's left over from the 70s. I mean, really, I think
we have cultural norms and standards.
I think most of the things that he's been accused of have always been inappropriate. I could get with that maybe sexualized comments in the workplace were much more tolerated back then, but that's not the only thing that he has done. So I think that's again, it's an excuse to minimize and sanitize and excuse his behavior. Most of the things that he has done and most of the things that other people have done that we use the same excuses for have always been inappropriate. Most of them have been illegal. That hasn't changed.
It's like no one should have to tell you shouldn't do that.
Right.
I'd like to just take a moment to address the parents out there. I'm a parent. I've got 3 kids, and I think as a parent, it's our responsibility to talk to our kids about this stuff. And I have a son and 2 daughters, so I feel like I maybe have to talk to them different ways. I don't know. That's why I'm asking you. I mean, I think it's very important for us to first tell our children that their bodies are their own and nobody else should be touching them and all of that good stuff. But as they get older and they start dating and doing things like that, are there bullet points? What can we do when we're talking to our kids? Help me out here.
Can you go to Kendra's house and get the talk for her?
Well, we certainly have resources on our website. And in fact, we have for several years on the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, we run the National Sexual Assault Awareness Month campaign every year right out of Harrisburg. Here's where it all comes from. And for several years, we have gone through resources around child sexual abuse prevention, working with tweens and teens, and then up into college. So we have lots of resources that are age appropriate. I think the most important thing, though, is that we talk to parents about how do you just make this part of your normal daily conversation? Because if you feel like, every 6 months I have to sit down and have like a real hard, I mean, then that feels really overwhelming and scary. Yeah, and it's not fun for anyone. But if you think about the fact that every day that you have that television on in your home, that you're watching a movie, listening to the radio, listening to iTunes or whatever it is you're tuning into, there are lyrics, There are situations in TV shows. There are things that are said in every single thing. You have a plethora of information, and not even to mention what's going on in the headlines. I mean, there's stuff that we all experience and listen to and sing along to in our homes every day that make it real easy to just turn to your kid and ask, what would you do if that happened? What if somebody said that to your friend? Does this happen in your school? What's your school do to talk about this? Like, how can you just open up normal, everyday conversations so that this is not a scary, overwhelming, uncomfortable conversation to have with your kid? That does two things. Like, number one, it gives you lots of opportunities to reinforce those values: kindness, looking out for one another, respect. You get to model that. But also, if you are a parent who's willing to have conversations about this more uncomfortable stuff on a regular basis, that means that you become a safe person for your child to come to, so that they might say to you, there's a rumor in my school about this teacher, or my friend talked to me about X, so if you become the parent who's comfortable talking about these things as a normal part of life, because unfortunately they are a normal part of life, then you're also creating an environment that's protective for your own child and maybe for their friends.
And more than anything, from what I've seen, at least, I'm not a parent, but kids watch what you do.
Absolutely.
It's not just what you say, it's the actions. So how I think men and women treat each other in a household does go a long way. I recently heard a parent say, commenting on the prevalence of sexting now with teenagers, saying, well, boys are going to be boys. They're going to ask for these pictures, but we need to teach girls to have self-respect.
Instead of telling the boys you don't ask for these pictures.
Exactly. And so when you're in a household where all the emphasis is on, oh, well, you have self-respect, but the boys don't need self-control, I do think that affects children and how they grow up into adults.
Yeah. I like that quote, actually, that girls need to have self-respect, but that boys don't have to have self-control.
Right.
I mean, that kind of almost wraps it up, really, because the women will be judged for how they dress, and just because a woman has cleavage, that's not an invitation to touch her boobs. Like, I feel like some men feel like that,
have to
though.
say. Yeah.
Some men feel like, oh, well, you have your boobs out. Why do you have them out?
Right.
No, it's not for you to grab them. Like, I'm just saying, that was just interesting the way
it's
you
like
said
your face is out. That's not an invitation for me to punch you.
What you just said, though, too, I think you're absolutely right about what goes on in the home, but parents can also enlist support from other adults. So are you asking your child's school or sports organization or youth group, what are your policies? Will you invite in a speaker to talk about consent? What kinds of things do you have in place? How do you screen the other adults who are involved in this program? If you and your friends can join forces and demonstrate to institutional leaders that this is an important thing, it makes it less scary then for the school to bring it in. So there are rape crisis programs all over this country who have expertise in doing age-appropriate prevention work, and they can come into those kinds of settings. They also come in to work with parents to help. All these things are like, it's nice to talk about, but to be comfortable doing it, you kind of have to practice. So it's good to have repeated exposure and repeated opportunities to think through, how would I say that, or what's the right way to respond, or have 3 or 4 things in your back pocket of like, how might I disrupt or redirect something, because you don't want to go through life being on the alert, ready to accuse somebody of grooming a child for sexual assault. Like, that's not going to be an effective intervention tool.
And it's probably going to make it harder for other people who have issues they're trying to raise.
But on the flip side, if you do go through life and you're willing to say to an adult who is making their behaviors making you uncomfortable, right? Like, we rarely get a clear flashing warning sign, but if you have an adult that's paying an awful lot of attention, offering to spend alone time, offer transportation, again, things that are really helpful to busy families. But if you're noticing and it's just making you feel a little off, there's nothing wrong with saying, Maybe I can help the next time. Or, a lot of the parents have noticed that you're really overly huggy with the kids and they're talking about it. I mean, number one, if the person's not doing anything wrong, that's nice of you to let them know that they're being perceived in that way.
The normal reaction to that would be, oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't want to be taken that way. Exactly.
Yeah.
But if it's somebody who does have ill intent that is slowly working on normalizing how frequently they're having physical contact with other kids.
That's just what they do. That's just how they, yeah.
Exactly. You're letting that person know, I see you and I'm willing to talk about it. That changes the dynamic in that situation, which might really be about building protection for the kids that adults interacting with. Alerting an official, whoever's in charge of that, like, this person's giving me the creeps. I'm watching some things that make me uncomfortable. I just want to let you know. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with standing up for the right thing.
James, I know you've been trying. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, just along the lines of what you guys were just talking about, probably one of the things that angered me a lot when it came to men and their reaction to this, especially with some who have been accused of doing some of these types of things, is then years later when they reflect and it's like, well, I may have done that and I am sorry, but now I have a daughter and now I know that this is wrong and this must stop. As if just because now you have a daughter, now this is an issue. When, if you have a son, this should be an issue.
That's right.
Not just a daughter.
Or if you're just like a human being who's allowed to interact with other people in society, it should be an issue. Right.
I saw somebody who said, your wife did not give birth to, or your wife gave birth to a human, not a moral compass.
Right.
But unfortunately, you're right. I think so many people can excuse it and feel like I can be detached from that until there really is finally somebody that it really matters about. So I think our job is to help people recognize, when your friends and family members and other people, when you realize that they've been keeping secrets all these years, until you saw the metoo hashtag or until they shared their story, we are impacted by that. We should all care because number one, nobody is safe from this. It cuts across all social divisions, but the ripple effects. I mean, even as an employer, people who have had these experiences or who are coming to work in a hostile workplace that you're not taking care of, that ends up impacting your bottom line with missed days of work, with productivity in the workplace. These things drive up healthcare from, our mental health and our physical health are not disconnected. So there are numerous long-term studies that show very high rates of correlation between experiencing, they call it adverse child experiences, which is a fancy way of saying things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect in the home, parental addiction, parental incarceration, mental illness. Any of those kinds of situations, the more of those things that you experience as a child, the more likely you are as an adult to have chronic health issues. We know that things like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, there are correlations there. When we look at mental health, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, suicidality, addiction, these things are all connected. So it behooves us to care.
And yet still there can be, and I think especially if you haven't experienced it or witnessed it, there's almost an instinct to get defensive. So instead of, oh my gosh, I didn't realize this was happening, it's like, well, this is an exaggeration, or I'm sick of everyone making this a women's issue. I had someone say, I'm tired of everyone making me feel guilty for being a man. And Dennis Owens, who is not here, had some great tweets over the weekend. He tweeted out a wonderful piece on Philly.com called Covering the PA Capitol While Female. And it's a female reporter's perspective on a lot of the things that happen. One person said, I'm shocked by this. And Dennis said, because you, like me, are older and male, I don't think any women in the building are shocked. I think understanding that what you have experienced and seen is not necessarily what everyone has experienced and seen is one of the first steps at actually getting at this issue.
And isn't that the whole point of the hashtag? To really show, I mean, if I look at that, it's a near universal experience for, how many people came forward and said, yeah, me too. Like this has happened. And that they're significant stories. And often there's more than one. So I mean, sorry to pop the bubble, but this really is a near universal experience for women in America.
It made me sad that I heard some people talking about not wanting to get involved because they saw it as a political thing. And I think we need to respect people who have stories who may not feel comfortable sharing. I think sometimes when something like this happens, there can be a certain pressure, almost like, well, why aren't you jumping in on this? And we need to be super aware of that. But it made me sad that some people saw this as a political thing, as a left thing versus a right thing. And you would hope that issue would kind of transcend politics.
I mean, you would it definitely does, because you see it happening in Washington and you see it happening in Hollywood.
Yeah. I mean, in that regard, it is a political issue. I mean, our political systems are full of this kind of behavior. But where does our funding for victim services come from, and for prevention, and for healthcare, and for all of the services that are out there to assist people who've had their lives really turned upside down by these kinds of experiences? Where's our nation's investment, our state's investment in that? You know, Pennsylvania is one of the few states in the nation that has a line item specifically there to support victim services for victims of sexual assault. There's a second one for victims of domestic violence. Many other states have not made it a public priority in that way by allocating dollars for that. And every year we have to cross our fingers and hope that we, fortunately, in that way we're an easy political issue to get behind, because nobody wants to be the person that cuts rape crisis services. It's not a good political move. But nonetheless, we get flat funding often. We went for more than a decade with flat funding until recent years. So, their politics are involved. And that's where, again, how can you be part of the solution? We can talk about how to be a good role model at home or in your community, but as a private citizen, are you asking people running for office what their opinions are on these things, if they support funding for services? Are you letting your officials know? Are you following what legislation is being introduced that makes sense to promote community safety? And if so, are you letting your elected officials know that that's important to you? We want people to involve the political system about this, because again, that sets the tone for our community standards. So be an active citizen and speak up and contact your legislator.
If someone sees something, whether it's at work or whatever, and goes, I'm not sure if that was sexual harassment, but I don't know that it's any of my business. What would you tell that person about what they should do? Or even the person who's experiencing something where it's uncomfortable, but you don't know if it rises to that level of reporting. Well,
the first thing is, if you're observing it, you can always check in with the person, like to say, I felt really uncomfortable by that. Are you okay? I mean, just by doing that's setting the tone of, I saw something, I'm checking in, realize you might be upset by that. Because if it made you uncomfortable, it may well have made that person uncomfortable. And then you can also let them have the option and offer, if this is something you want to report, I'm willing to go on record about what I saw too. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing that. If you work for a company, and again, what can I do? Ask your own employer, what are our policies? What are our procedures? Do we have training? If you take that training and it's a hokey, boring training that's easy to shrug off because it's like a cheesy thing, which I'm sorry, a lot of sexual harassment trainings really are. They're very poorly done. They're put to, I'm going to say it, they're put together oftentimes by attorneys that are helping check a box that we've had some kind of training, but they're not done in a real life scenario. So tell your employer you want to bring somebody else in to do the training. Get somebody who can do a better job at it, because it really matters. But if there is an anonymous reporting capacity in your place of employment, there's really no harm done to say, I saw this, it made me uncomfortable. I don't know if this really rises to the level, but I felt it was the right thing to do to let management know that they might want to pay attention, and call attention to who the person was. It's not an outright accusation, but you would want your employees to do that if there was anything else going on. Like I'm not sure if that was embezzlement, but I'm going to let you know maybe. Nobody would say, "Oh gosh, you really should investigate on your own and not tell your employer until you know for certain." We recognize that's a risk. This is a risk too.
But go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I have a question just for everyone. What is it about right now that, these cases have come forward. This is not new. This has been happening forever. But right now, this really seems to be dominating the media. People are talking about this. People are being fired for things that happened decades ago. Right now, what is it about right now that's causing people to talk about this? And do you feel this will last?
I am hopeful. I'm also a cynic because I've been doing this work for 25 years, so I'm not gonna say yes, it's gonna last, but I'm hopeful, and here's why. We have been seeing, I think, a growing momentum around addressing these issues in I'm gonna ballpark it, about the past 5 years. I really believe social media is a big part of that. Now, this is anecdotal. I don't think that we have good research right now to measure what's happening in our society. But I can tell you, if you look at what started with the church scandals, and then Sandusky, and then campus sexual assault right on the heels. We had social media as a tool for people to start, number one, sharing the news story. So our information about it now is crossing community lines, state lines. When people want to know what can we do to fix it, you're not limited to your own community, your own circle of friends. There are online communities of people that do this work, so it's making organizing better. We're sharing resources more. Even to the point of sharing and this really does happen. I mean, I'm involved in groups of activists that have private Facebook groups, a campus activist. I can get online and say, I just talked to a reporter from this part of the country. They'd like to talk to somebody who's willing to go on record about X, Y, and Z, and I can connect them. And students are doing that and sharing the names of news reporters to help people get their stories out. I mean, that's the role of the press, is institutional accountability.
Right, yeah. And when you talk about, gutsy investigative reporting, Harvey Weinstein managed to shut this story down before at a different publication before it came out. Right. And I think now that there is a recognition that some of that power that used to be so sacred is waning a little bit. There are cracks.
Yep.
There's more room for stuff to seep in and then break things wide open, assuming you have a persistent and diligent person determined to get that information out.
James, I think for me, why this time is different, and I told you guys this before we started rolling, the whole hashtag metoo, people started asking me, oh, could you say that too? And I actually sat down and started reflecting on my life and wrote down issues of things that have happened to me, and I was shocked at how long the list was. And I think as women, we've always been taught, you just deal with it and you move on. And there never was
brush it off.
Yeah, and there never really was a sit down, this happened to me, and how about you, and how about you? And it was just, I think that's why, and I truly do think it's the social media. Everybody, there was a common wow.
Yeah, it's oh, you've been flashed, I've been flashed.
Yes,
you've been groped, I've been
yes.
groped.
So I think that's what made it so different. And I think the cracks that people are now saying, I'm tired of it. And there's power in numbers. So when you have all of those people saying, look, we're tired of this and this needs to stop. And I think that is why it's just not dying down this time. It really seems to be carrying on.
It is, and it's spreading into more and more industries, which I think is helpful in blowing off that lid. But that ability to, if you stop to think about in therapy, one of the things that we know is most effective for helping survivors of abuse recover is going to group therapy. And why is that? Because when you sit there and you talk to other people who've had the same experiences, who felt the same way, who kept silent for the same reasons, all of a sudden you realize that there was nothing wrong with you, that what you've been going through is normal. It's a part of validating that what happened really truly was bad, because all these other people that it happened to went through the same feelings and reactions. Social media is doing that now on a much larger scale, and it is breaking down the silence and the shame and the stigma. And we're also seeing people out there care. So suddenly,
people out there saying, I believe you.
Yeah, exactly. So when people say, why don't victims report? My answer is always the same. They don't trust the rest of us to respond appropriately. Well, when you can get on your social media feed and see that there are lots of people responding appropriately, it suddenly makes it safe to talk about.
Because it does jade you when you do speak up and then either nothing happens or it gets discounted. I think people underestimate how much of an effect that has on a person on a group, and how much validation it can give a perpetrator.
That's right.
Can you give us some websites, resources really quick? We're running out of time, and I knew we would, but it's for those who can't click, just let them know where they can go for information.
Sure. The Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape's website is pcar.org. If you are looking to get assistance, either for services for yourself or a loved one, or you want to find out about prevention in your community, we have a tab on that website that says Get Help in PA, so go there. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center, I'm going to say that again slowly. It's National Sexual Violence Resource Center. So our website is nsvrc.org. We always have a big button on there for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, SAAM. And if you click on that, you can go to our past campaigns where you're going to find resources for parents, resources for teachers, general information. We also house the world's largest library on resources. So if there's something that you want, you can get in touch with us, send an email what you're looking for. We have librarians on staff who are happy to help out. So, and we can also connect folks in other communities to services in their state.
All right, Kristen Houser, thank you so much for being here and talking with us today.
Thank you.
All right, if you'd like to check out the links to the stories, articles, and videos we discussed, you can find them in our show notes on our website, abc27.com. To get On Deadline delivered directly to your phone, tablet, or computer each week, subscribe in iTunes or Google Play Music. Record your thoughts, questions, and suggestions about episodes and voice memos on your phone, and then email them to us at theinvestigators@abc27.com. Please take a few minutes and leave us a review in iTunes. It helps our podcast reach other people and helps us figure out what we can do to improve. Thank you, Eric Semmel, for producing this podcast, Jason Dietz for composing and recording the music. It's time for us to go. We're on deadline.